Inside Angola, 10 prisoners who rewrote what dangerous looks like Louisiana State Penitentiary. Most people think danger inside prison is obvious. Raised voices, fights, lockdowns. But inside Angola prison, danger often looks calm. Some of the most influential inmates do not attract attention. They wait. They observe. And over time, they learn how the system moves, who enforces rules, who bends them, and who looks the other way. This documentary is not about chaos. It is about control. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Angola Prison, officially known as the Louisiana State Penitentiary, is the largest maximum security prison in the United States. Located on former plantation land, it houses individuals serving some of the longest sentences in the American justice system. This documentary does not dramatize violence or glorify crime. Instead, it examines how extreme confinement shapes behavior, decision-making, and power among inmates classified as high risk. Using verified research from the National Institute of Justice, the American Psychological Association, and decades of prison sociology, this investigation looks beyond headlines to understand how danger actually functions inside long-term incarceration. What emerges is not a story of constant violence, but of adaptation, psychological pressure, and influence operating quietly over time. Why dangerous is often misunderstood. In public imagination, dangerous prisoners are impulsive and unpredictable. Research suggests the opposite is often true. According to studies reviewed by the National Institute of Justice, inmates responsible for the most serious institutional harm are frequently those with high levels of behavioral control. Rather than acting emotionally, they calculate risk, delay action, and use others to achieve outcomes. Psychologist Craig Haney explains that long-term incarceration rewards restraint. In rigid environments, inmates who learn to regulate emotions and suppress visible aggression gain advantages: fewer disciplinary reports, greater access to movement, and reduced scrutiny from staff. This creates a contradiction. The inmates most capable of causing harm are often the least visible in official records. Sociologist John Irwin described this adaptation as a survival response to total institutions. Over time, inmates learn that influence is safer than confrontation. Reputation replaces force. Silence replaces threat. In Angola, where many sentences extend decades or life, this adaptation becomes deeply ingrained. Time itself becomes a strategic resource. Those who can wait often gain leverage over those who cannot. The result is a form of danger that does not announce itself. It blends into routine. It looks stable. And because it looks stable, it is often misunderstood. How influence spreads without violence. In high-security prisons, power rarely moves in straight lines. Research supported by the National Institute of Justice shows that influence inside long-term incarceration often develops through social positioning rather than physical force. Inmates who understand routines, relationships, and informal norms can shape outcomes without ever breaking a rule. One documented pattern is proxy action. Instead of acting directly, influential inmates allow others to take visible risks. This preserves their own disciplinary record while extending their reach. Studies from the Chicago Crime Lab identify similar structures in external criminal networks, where authority is maintained by distance from direct involvement. Another pattern involves information control. In closed environments, knowledge becomes leverage, knowing who is under pressure, who is vulnerable, and who seeks protection. Research cited by the American Psychological Association notes that individuals with strong cognitive regulation often excel at reading emotional cues, allowing them to anticipate conflict before it surfaces. At Angola, where movement and access are tightly regulated, these dynamics operate quietly. Influence may appear as mediation, conflict prevention, or leadership in daily routines. Yet these same roles can mask deeper power structures that operate beyond formal oversight. Importantly, this influence does not require intimidation. It relies on consistency. Inmates who remain calm during stress, who avoid impulsive reactions, often become anchors within their social groups. Over time, others defer to them, not out of fear, but predictability. Correctional studies show that such inmates are rarely flagged by traditional risk tools. Their behavior aligns with institutional expectations, even as their influence grows. This is how control spreads in plain sight, without raised voices, without confrontation, and without triggering alarms. And once established, it is difficult to trace. Identity formed by permanence. When incarceration has no clear endpoint, identity begins to reorganize around the institution itself. Research reviewed by the American Psychological Association shows that individuals serving extremely long sentences experience a gradual shift in how they define purpose and responsibility. Future-oriented goals fade, replaced by present-focused strategies aimed at stability and psychological survival. Psychologist Craig Haney describes this process as an internal adaptation to total environments. Over time, inmates learn which parts of themselves must be restrained and which can be refined. Emotional expression becomes selective. Trust becomes conditional. In Angola, this process is intensified by permanence. Many inmates will never leave. Without the prospect of reintegration, identity is no longer shaped by who one will become outside, but by who one must be inside. Sociological research by John Irwin highlights how this leads to role-based identities. Some inmates become observers. Others become mediators or organizers. A smaller group evolves into strategists, individuals who manage relationships, diffuse tension, and quietly influence outcomes. Moral reasoning also adapts. Studies cited by the APA indicate that in environments where autonomy is limited, ethical decisions are often evaluated through the lens of balance rather than principle. Actions are judged by whether they maintain order, reduce risk, or protect one's position. This does not eliminate conscience. It reshapes it. Inside Angola, identity becomes durable. Once a role is established, changing it can destabilize social equilibrium. Stability becomes safety. Consistency becomes currency. And when identity aligns fully with containment, behavior appears controlled, even when underlying risk remains. When order hides risk. Correctional systems are built to measure behavior. They are far less effective at measuring intention. Risk assessment tools used in maximum security prisons prioritize observable actions, disciplinary reports, recorded conflicts, and past convictions. According to analysis published through the National Institute of Justice, these systems perform well at identifying impulsive or repeatedly disruptive inmates, but struggle with individuals who display long-term behavioral control. This creates a structural blind spot. Psychological research reviewed by the American Psychological Association explains that when people understand the rules of observation, they can regulate outward behavior without altering internal motives. Compliance becomes a strategy rather than a transformation. At Angola, this dynamic unfolds over years. Inmates who learn how staff rotations work, how reports are written, and which behaviors trigger attention can remain institutionally clean while gradually accumulating influence. Their files reflect stability. Their presence reflects authority. Another limitation lies in how information travels. Findings consistent with Chicago Crime Lab research show that social intelligence within closed systems is often fragmented. One officer may sense subtle shifts in inmate relationships. Another may notice patterns of deference or silence. Without integration, these signals remain isolated and incomplete. Long-term confinement also affects perception on both sides. Studies in correctional psychology note that routine can dull vigilance. When weeks become months and months become years without major incidents, quiet is interpreted as safety. But quiet does not mean neutral. Sociologist John Irwin observed that prisons often function through parallel structures, the formal system of rules and the informal system of relationships. When the two align, stability increases. When they diverge, risk accumulates invisibly. In Angola, where permanence defines daily life, informal structures can become deeply entrenched before they are recognized as influential. By the time attention shifts, influence has already normalized. Order, in this context, can conceal more than it reveals. Managing risk that never ends. Correctional institutions are designed around the idea that behavior can be shaped through consequences. But permanent sentences change that equation. According to research supported by the National Institute of Justice, traditional deterrents, loss of privileges, segregation, or disciplinary sanctions, lose effectiveness when inmates no longer fear additional punishment. When there is little left to lose, compliance must be achieved through structure rather than threat. To manage this, facilities like Angola rely heavily on predictability. Daily routines are tightly regulated. Movement is controlled. Expectations are consistent. Psychological research reviewed by the American Psychological Association shows that predictability can reduce anxiety and limit impulsive behavior in high-risk populations. Yet predictability has a side effect. Over time, routines become transparent. Inmates learn when oversight is strongest, when attention shifts, and where flexibility exists. What stabilizes behavior also reveals patterns that can be navigated. Some institutions introduce responsibility-based roles for inmates who demonstrate long-term compliance, educational aides, peer mentors, work supervisors. Sociological studies by John Irwin suggest these roles can reduce conflict and foster order. But they also concentrate informal influence when monitoring is insufficient. At Angola, where inmate labor and internal programs are woven into daily operations, authority does not flow exclusively from staff. Informal leaders often emerge alongside formal structures, shaping norms and resolving disputes quietly. Segregation remains an option for managing acute risk, but APA research warns that prolonged isolation can intensify cognitive rigidity and emotional volatility, particularly in inmates already adapted to control-based thinking. As a result, institutions balance on a narrow edge. Too much restriction increases internal pressure. Too much autonomy allows influence to spread beyond oversight. Permanent risk cannot be eliminated. It can only be managed, and management itself reshapes behavior. Containment is not transformation. Prisons exist to protect society by removing risk from public life. They are not designed to resolve what created that risk. Research reviewed by the National Institute of Justice draws a clear distinction between containment and change. Facilities like Angola succeed in controlling behavior through structure, supervision, and isolation. But psychological transformation requires conditions that prisons are rarely built to provide. Studies cited by the American Psychological Association show that long-term incarceration can stabilize actions without altering underlying cognitive frameworks. Compliance may increase. Discipline reports may decrease. Yet internal motivations often remain unchanged, shaped instead by adaptation to confinement. Psychologist Craig Haney emphasizes that when identity reorganizes around control rather than accountability, growth stalls. Individuals learn how to function within the system, not how to reconcile harm, responsibility, or moral reasoning beyond it. Sociologist John Irwin observed that institutions develop order through parallel systems, formal rules and informal norms. When these systems coexist without conflict, prisons appear calm. But calm does not equal resolution. It often reflects equilibrium rather than healing. At Angola, where many inmates will never leave, containment becomes permanent. Behavior may remain stable for years, even decades. But stability alone does not eliminate risk, it only reshapes it. Understanding this reality is not about sympathy or fear. It is about accuracy. If justice systems focus solely on order, they risk mistaking silence for safety. True prevention begins with understanding how behavior adapts under extreme conditions, and where those adaptations can fail. This documentary examined Angola prison through verified research, psychological analysis, and documented institutional patterns, without sensationalism and without fiction. If you value fact-based investigations that go beyond headlines and explore why behavior emerges, not just what happened, consider subscribing. New documentaries focus on real institutions, real research, and real human behavior, presented responsibly and accurately. Understanding is not endorsement. It is awareness. And awareness is where prevention begins.